uh, should the Constitution treat religion as special or as just another ideology or an outpouring of good works?
You want to go first this time, EJ, and I'll back
You leave me the tough one. Yeah, I will go first. I think that I'm going to give a probably an unsatisfactorily balanced answer to that, I hope, or an yes but kind of answer. I think religion is treated especially because it's the first right within the First Amendment, which tells us something. B, I think the founders were saying by having the two clauses that on the one hand, on any other issue, a democratic polity can fight it out and decide yes or no. But they are saying that on religion, even if a majority holds a particular faith view, that position cannot be established by the state. That's already, I think, treating religion in a special way. And that first responsibility, not to seek the establishment of your religion, then is what reinforces the right on the back end, in the second clause. And this has led to a lot of conflict in our times over where should and should not government cooperate with religion. We have had a certain degree of cooperation between government and religious institutions from the beginning in areas like healthcare and education and poverty alleviation. But I think there are serious limits on how deeply the government can get enmeshed with religion that aren't necessarily there for other forms of civil society. So to the extent that religion is treated specially, and I think that both those clauses suggest that it is, it gives religion certain particular rights, but also there are particular limitations on the state's relationship with religion.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, my sense is I'm glad the Constitution deals with it separately, and in part for the reasons that I think both EJ and I have been speaking to, which is this is a human reality. Religion and faith are going to have to be dealt with in one way or another. And I think the American founders understood that. And so they thought, how can we deal with this fact of life in a way that's more constructive than destructive? Now, you could ignore it and just pretend that it doesn't exist. But I think what they said is that it is there and it matters. And so let's put it within a context and parameters that increases the chances of it being a healthy force in society rather than a destructive force in society. So in a sense, if they would have punted and ignored the issue, I think the chances are that it could have gone sideways more than it has. So another thing in terms of historical context, which is worth keeping in mind, which is if you go back and you read the founders, and whether you're talking about Franklin or Adams, either Adams, John or Sam Adams, Madison, Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, I mean, they all spoke to the importance of religion to a free society. And we'll bracket now, the issue of whether they were right about that. But essentially, if you read there, and I should say here, not all of them were practicing Christians by any means. Probably all of them or most of them were deists. Some of them may have been public deists, but privately not so much. But in any event, that is the view that they had. And so they believed religion was important for a free society because they believed religion was an anchor of morality. And of course, often it is, but sometimes it's not. And that is what we are dealing with and what they dealt with. And so I'm glad they were explicit. I suppose to use an analogy, it would be if you're in a human relationship, in a family or a friendship or a marriage, and there are issues that you have to face, you can either name them and address them, or you can just pretend they don't exist. But if you pretend they don't exist, they'll come out one way or another. So I think that the founders did what they could to try and channel these human realities, human impulses, human beliefs in a helpful way.
I think that Pete puts his finger on something that is, I think, that points us to something that may be different about the time we are living through now and create real challenges that we've got to grapple with. Um, Even when there were always non-believers, doubters, freethinkers in the United States, but there was at the founding a broad social consensus that at the very least, people often said they were affiliated with a religious institution. They gave credit to religion for various social goods. We live in a time that is really quite new, particularly among young Americans, that when you look at Americans under 35, under 40, we're now talking about 40% plus who declare themselves unaffiliated with any religious tradition. There are all kinds of arguments about what that means about the real political views, but that is really unprecedented. Earlier, younger generations, earlier cohorts were not that disconnected from religion. And I think that in that sense, we are becoming somewhat more like Europe, I think, Western Europe in particular, in our attitude toward religion. And I think that's going to create challenges for how we look at the First Amendment. I mean, non-belief is a kind of ultimate concern as well. A rejection of theism is an important philosophical position that now many, a very large number of Americans engage with. And so if you ask the question, why are we having so many fights about religion right now? And the political scientist John Green has sort of underscored this. You had on the one hand a resurgence, it's stalled now, but a resurgence of evangelical Christianity in a conservative form 20 or 30 years ago. And at the other end, you have a real surge of religious disaffiliation. It is unsurprising that we have a lot of conflict around these questions now. And it raises a lot of issues that I think I don't have full answers to myself at the moment that I'm struggling with, but that I think we should, in the spirit of Pete's call, don't try to sweep things under the rug. I think we have to grapple with in a new and different way than we have in the past.
Yeah, and just I completely agree with that. And just to underscore and amplify a little bit on it, these issues, of course, are not new now. I mean, you go back, right? Because what the court has to do is it has to interpret what the First Amendment means in real circumstances, and that shifts over time. So the issue of school prayer was decided in 1947 that you couldn't impose mandatory school prayer, and then it gets very complicated because you strike down prayer in public schools, but you can uphold prayer in Congress. Or you can say the military can have chaplains, but schools can't have chaplains. I mean, so you go through and you try and say, well, what is this balance that we have to fit that takes these two elements of the free expression and the Establishment Clause together, and in real practical cases, in real lives, what does it mean? And that's always been a difficult challenge, and it's more of a challenge now, I would say, for the reasons that E.J. said, because there was a much wider consensus of religious faith, and particularly kind of Protestant Christianity in American past than there is today, and that just has to be taken into account.
Pete, I don't mean to be pedantic. Wasn't the school prayer decision in 62? I believe the school, because I have always, I'm just looking it up on St. Google, the infallible St. Google. Anyway, I just, without challenging your broader point, I think it's important to locate it in the 60s, because that's when a lot of court decisions also came together to create a kind of backlash among parts of the country.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it was there was a preceding case in 47 that began to establish the so-called separation of the wall of separation.
Yeah,
of course, not in the Constitution; it was Jeffersonian. So I think the school prayer case was in the 60s. There were earlier cases that began that distancing, which culminated in that case. So you're absolutely right to point that out.
I'd like to continue a thread that you both have been going down over the last several questions. I mean, you hear people use the phrase separation of church and state, but as you both have been giving examples, there's actually this long history in our country of religious engagement in our politics. As you said, abolition and slavery, the civil rights movement, the pro-life movement today. What would you say, to kind of flesh this out a little bit more, what are the pros and cons of this connection between religion and politics in US life, if you could name any? And Pete, if you want to start, I'll direct it towards you, since I think you brought this up initially.
Sure. I mean, I would say that the pros of it is that politics, in my estimation, is ultimately about justice and the pursuit of justice. And faith and religion, in my understanding of it, I'm speaking as a person of the Christian faith, and this applies to faiths that are non-Christian as well, is a means to advance justice. Now, that's not all that religion is, of course. There are issues of soteriology and eternal life and all sorts of doctrines. But I also think that certainly my reading of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament is you can't pry apart my understanding of faith from the pursuit of justice. And it's, as we've talked about, there's been a powerful piston in the engines of justice in American history, whether it's the abolitionist movement or the civil rights movement. And so I think religion can be a source of justice and of human flourishing and of human good. And even in the examples that E.J. rightly raised about, immigration, it's sometimes, again, religion can be used as a battering ram, but it's also people of religious faith who speak up for immigrants and undocumented workers and refugees. And why do they do it? Because they believe in a human anthropology, that people are born with inherent human dignity. That was really the argument of Lincoln, by the way, as well. I mean, Lincoln tied very much, of course. He was deeply informed by Bible and faith. He wasn't a traditional Christian, as most people understand it. But there's no question that if you read his writings, and it culminated in the second inaugural, that was an expression of faith that I think can be a healing force in society and a driver of justice.
Yeah, it's always worth remembering the words separation of church and state are not in the First Amendment. They're in the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists. But that's important, too, because he was invoking that phrase to defend their rights as a then very dissenting religious tradition. I think a friend of both of ours, Jean Bethke Elshtain, put it well when she said separation of church and state is one thing, and separation of religion and politics is something else again, because you can never achieve a separation of religion from politics simply because so many people root their political convictions in some analysis of what their tradition teaches. And I once debated Ralph Reed, where I said I defend his right to root his views in Scripture, because many of my views come from my own Catholic tradition, although I have to ask him where he finds a passage where Jesus supports a cut in the capital gains tax, because I just can't find it in mine, although I guess if you're really sophisticated, maybe you go to the parable of the talents or something like that. But I think that there are, again, in a pluralistic society, obligations on those who might have their religious views, their political views closely connected to their religious beliefs, to honor the fact that many people don't share their religious assumptions. I think there is I guess it's an informal, but I think important obligation on the one hand, to be honest about the ways in which your faith might influence your belief, but on the other hand, to separate your arguments so that you can make an argument that is accessible to people who don't share your belief. I could say, I am for Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan because of what Jesus said about how we should treat the poor. And at some level, that would be an honest statement. My views on poverty and my support for many of the provisions of that bill are rooted in that, in that deep-seated belief that for me goes back a long way. But I don't think that's good enough for me to persuade Pete or anybody on this call to say, therefore, you all must agree with me on Build Back Better. And I think we could pick an example on the other side of politics to make exactly the same point.
Yeah, I'll just say, building on what E.J. said, having worked in government in the White House and being involved in politics as E.J. has been for pretty much most of our adult lives, either as involved in, practicers of, or commentators about. This is a complicated set of questions because I think speaking for myself, and I think from what E.J. said as well, and just knowing him, that our faith informs certain views, which politics affects, right? Which is I was saying, human anthropology, justice, and so forth. But when you go from the principle to the particulars of the policies, that's where the challenges come in. So I've always been very, very wary throughout my life to make a kind of connect the dots move from a principle of helping the poor, or I mean, you can take any number of principles that you find within the Hebrew scriptures or the Bible, and then say that means that anybody is going to support, House Bill A, B, or C, or Senate Bill, whatever. But it matters too, and in some cases, the issues that come before you, I think, are more obvious than others. I mean, if you take a really extreme example, you look at Bonhoeffer, Nazi Germany, and the Confessing Church, and that had a very practical, concrete reality to what he understood his Christian faith informed. But most issues aren't like that, and there are prudential differences that people have over all sorts of legislation, even on the hot button issues of gender and of poverty and of abortion and so forth. And so, we have to give each other the room to the degree possible to respect that there are prudential judgments, issues of discernment and discretion and wisdom that try and apply, and this is true of faith and non-faith, but to try and apply the principle of justice to particular public policies in any given moment in time.
Just to be clear, I at least about my view, I think it is entirely legitimate in a public debate if someone claims, I subscribe, we'll say, for the purposes of this call, to the Christian tradition and believe it teaches X and Y. And then for someone who may think they are radically misapplying that tradition or being very selective about the tradition, I think it is fair to ask this particular person in a real debate, are you actually being true to that position? I think when people put religion on the table as part of their rationale for believing X or Y, it is entirely legit to debate them within that context. And that's where it gets complicated because, I think such debates are useful. Sometimes they're useful to our humility and learning that we're inconsistent, but they're also useful to the tradition itself, to the, to say, what does or does this not teach? Because if you just say it's just what everyone thinks it is, then you're reducing all of it to mush, and that's not particularly helpful to anybody.
It's well said. I completely agree with that.
So let me clean up here with this final question. So to what extent does the promotion of religious freedom enhance the cause of human rights? We'll let E.J., do you want to start with that? And then Pete, wrap us up.
I think it's fundamental to human rights because in so many nations, the violation of human rights is connected to religion or to ethnicity tied to religion. One thinks of the Uyghurs in China as one of many good examples. Both parties, both parties in our country, and I think people of very broad philosophical views, ideological views, have supported the existence of an ambassador for religious freedom within the government, parts of the State Department dedicated to religious freedom, because religious freedom is a human right. Again, just to go back to where I started with the First Amendment, all of those rights are intertwined. And so I think it's now, again, we can have all kinds of arguments at the next level down about where religious freedom fits into this, what the obligations of the US government are in these particular cases. But I, for one, think that human rights and religious rights and speech rights are indivisible. They all go together. And when you stand up for one, you're standing up for another.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully articulated by E.J. I mean, I think that the religious liberty absolutely enhances the cause of human rights, and history is filled with it, not just in our country, but in other nations. It is worth noting that some of the really awful totalitarian movements of the 20th century tried to destroy religious liberty because it was by definition totalitarian, which is they wanted to control all aspects of human life, of human personality, of human thought. And some of the great dissident figures in the 20th and 21st century were people of faith, because they had a certain view of human anthropology, human dignity, and human rights, which allowed them to say that the state can't do certain things and act in certain ways, and that there's a right way to treat people, and there are objectively correct ways to treat people and mistreat people, and you have to stand for that. And I think religious freedom allows those things to be expressed and to flourish. And just one more personal note on this: it's not religious freedom per se, but I do think it touches on this broader issue of faith and the common good, and that was my experience with George W. Bush with the global AIDS and malaria initiatives, which wasn't done simply for religious reasons, but I believe that President Bush's religious faith made him more alert to and attuned to, and the arguments for the global AIDS initiative resonated with him, in part because I think his faith shaped who he was and shaped his sensibilities in a powerful way. And I know that there were people within the White House who were advocating for that, in part because their religious faith informed that view. And PEPFAR is responsible for having saved, I think, somewhere around 15 million or more lives on the African continent. Thankfully, his successors have built on it. There are other examples, of course, throughout history that it happens, but that was just one that was sort of up close and personal for me, and I think an example of where faith and political leaders, including in a president, rightly understood, can do enormous human good. And I think that's one of the great legacies of President Bush.
We should end on Pete's uplifting note, and I don't think there's anybody in the country who doesn't respect PEPFAR and what was achieved there. If there is, I've never met that person. But I also think we need to acknowledge that while many of the great dissidents have been religious people, religious traditions have also made themselves complicit at many times in history. If you look at the struggle within the churches in Nazi Germany is as good an example as any. There were some people who, in the name of religion, made themselves complicit with authoritarian or totalitarian leaders. Even someone like Hitler, who probably underneath it all really wanted to defeat Christianity and abolish it, but in fact had some pretty strong alliances within the Christian churches. So all that is to say is that what we all need is more humility than we ever display, myself included. How can you claim humility when you write a newspaper column, for goodness sake? But that, all of our traditions can be distorted and used badly. So again, maybe that's where I would close, that, we all have to struggle with the best understanding we can get to within our own traditions, and try to remember not to be too Niebuhrian about it, our own capacities for sin, which sometimes seem infinite to me.